A letter arrived at FIFA's Zurich headquarters on a Tuesday in late March, and it did not come from where these letters usually come from. It was not from a government, not from a broadcaster, not from a sponsor quietly pulling its logo off a stadium banner. It came from Canadian soccer fans, ordinary men and women who had waited years for this moment, who had saved money for it, who had booked hotel rooms in Vancouver and Toronto and Calgary months in advance, who had dreamed about their country hosting the biggest sporting event in the history of this continent. The letter said they would not be coming. Not because the games had been moved, not because ticket prices had spiraled beyond reach, because of the man in the White House, because of what his administration had done to the country they called home, and because crossing a border into the United States, even for the World Cup, even for something they had waited years to experience, felt to them like a form of approval they were no longer willing to give. That is the inversion at the center of this story. And it is unlike anything that has happened before in the modern history of major international sport. Canada is a co-host of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, a tournament so large it rewrote the record books before a single match was played. An immeasurable, organized, growing portion of Canada's own fans have decided they want no part of it. Not as a social media gesture, not as a hashtag that trends for a weekend and disappears. As a structured, coordinated, legally documented withdrawal from an event their country spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars preparing to share with the world. What you're about to hear is how that boycott started, how it spread across 3 continents to supporters clubs in Germany, Mexico, and Argentina, and what it has exposed about the commercial and diplomatic foundations of the most watched tournament on Earth. And there is a statement made publicly by FIFA President Gianni Infantino in February that I will read to you before this is over. Senior sports policy analysts say it reveals more about what that organization privately fears than any press conference was ever supposed to. But first you need to meet the man who started this. His name is Daniel Rourke. He is 47 years old. He is an electrician from Burnaby, British Columbia. He has held a Canadian men's national team season pass for 11 consecutive years. He is not a politician. He is not an activist by training or profession. He is a soccer fan, the kind of deeply committed supporter that every national team's ecosystem depends on and rarely thinks about until something goes wrong. In January of this year, 2 weeks after the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian goods and threatened to reclassify the border as a trade enforcement zone, Rourke opened a private thread on a Canadian supporters group forum and typed a single question: should we be filling American stadiums while this is happening? He told The Athletic in April that he expected the thread to generate a few dozen replies and then go quiet. That is not what happened. Within 10 days, more than 4,000 Canadian supporters had responded. Within 3 weeks, a formal coalition calling itself Fair Weather had published a public statement signed by representatives of 18 registered Canadian supporters clubs. The statement announced that members would not purchase tickets to World Cup matches held at American venues: the Rose Bowl in Los Angeles, MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, a TNT Stadium in Dallas, Levi's Stadium in San Francisco. They were not calling on others to follow. They were stating what they had already decided for themselves. And the dimension that almost every major outlet missed when covering this story was the most important one. This did not begin as an anti-FIFA protest. It was not a campaign against soccer or against the World Cup itself. It was Canadian fans doing what citizens in functioning democracies have always done when the political environment shifts beneath their feet. They made a calculation about where their money was going and what it was signaling. And for thousands of them, that calculation came out the same way. To understand what that moment represents in its full historical weight, you have to reach back 45 years. January 1980. President Jimmy Carter announces that the United States will boycott the Moscow Summer Olympics unless Soviet troops withdraw from Afghanistan within 30 days. They do not withdraw. 65 nations eventually join the boycott. The Moscow Games, the most expensive in history to that point, are held before half-empty international sections. Athletes who train for 4 years never compete. Medals are won by competitors who know their best rivals are absent, and those medals carry an asterisk that history never fully removed. The structural parallel to 2026 is not exact, but it is genuine. In 1980, governments used sport as a diplomatic instrument. They withdrew their athletes to send a political signal their diplomats had decided needed sending. What is happening in 2026 is the precise inversion of that model. Fans withdrawing themselves, without government instruction, without state coordination to send a signal their own governments have declined to send. Canada has not called for a boycott. FIFA has not been sanctioned. The political establishments on both sides of the border have remained carefully, deliberately silent. But the fans moved anyway. And the mechanism through which they moved is something genuinely new in the history of organized sport. Jules Boykoff has spent 3 decades studying the intersection of sport and geopolitics. He is a professor at Pacific University and the author of Power Games, A Political History of the Olympics. In an essay published in April in The Nation, Boykoff wrote that what is emerging ahead of 2026 represents something that does not have a clear historical precedent. Historically, he observed, boycotts of this kind required state architecture, government coordination, diplomatic channels, national Olympic committees acting under explicit political instruction from their own governments, the whole apparatus of official international disapproval. What is organizing ahead of 2026 requires none of that. It runs on the same digital infrastructure that runs modern supporter culture: group chats, forum threads, coalition newsletters. A question typed by an electrician in Burnaby that reached supporters groups on 3 continents within 72 hours. The mechanism is new. The impulse, Boykoff wrote, is ancient. Sport has always been the place where political feeling finds its most vivid public expression. That has never changed. What has changed is the speed at which that feeling can organize itself without asking anyone's permission. The Fairweather Coalition statement reached supporters groups in Mexico within 3 days of its publication. Now, this is the part of the story where the scale of the problem starts to become visible, because Mexico is not a peripheral participant in the 2026 World Cup. Mexico is a co-host. 3 Mexican cities are scheduled to host matches. Mexican fans were expected to travel to American venues in enormous numbers to follow their national team through the bracket. That was not an assumption. It was embedded in the commercial projections that underpinned the tournament's economic model. According to reporting by Marca in March, at least 6 major Mexican supporters groups had discussed the fair weather statement internally and were considering parallel declarations of their own. Not calling on their members to skip Mexican-hosted matches, but questioning whether to purchase tickets for the American legs of the tournament at all. And the calculus for Mexican supporters is complicated by a different but overlapping political tension: the Trump administration's immigration enforcement posture, its effect on the tens of millions of Mexican Americans who had been expected to form the core audience at American venues. A tournament whose commercial model depends on that audience arriving in those numbers is a tournament whose commercial model has a structural vulnerability that was not in the original prospectus. Think about what that actually means in practice. A stadium in New Jersey or Dallas built for the World Cup, ticketed for the World Cup, photographed from above and broadcast to 1 billion viewers as proof of the World Cup's scale, but missing a significant share of the audience whose physical presence and spending behavior the entire projection was calculated around. Not empty, just wrong in ways that matter. Return for a moment to Daniel Rourke, because his personal decision is more strategically precise than most coverage recognized. Rourke has made clear he will attend Canadian-hosted matches. He has tickets to the match in Vancouver. He is not boycotting the tournament. He is drawing a line inside it, attending the parts of it that happen in the country he is willing to support with his money and presence, declining the parts that cross a border he has decided, for reasons he can state in a single sentence, he will not cross. That is structurally a more sustainable and more politically precise form of protest than a blanket withdrawal. It does not hand FIFA the easy narrative of fans abandoning football. It hands FIFA a harder problem: fans who love football deeply enough to still attend, but who have drawn a line that maps exactly onto the political geography of the dispute. Canadian fans for Canadian venues, not for American ones. And that precision is considerably harder for FIFA to dismiss as fringe behavior. Now, here is the statement I told you about at the beginning. In February, speaking at a sports governance conference in Doha, FIFA President Gianni Infantino addressed the question of the World Cup's political environment. According to a transcript published by Inside World Football, Infantino said the following: "Football does not need politics. Politics needs football." He described the World Cup as a neutral space that belongs to the fans of the world rather than to the governments that surround it. Senior analysts who follow FIFA's institutional behavior read that statement very differently than it was presented. Infantino has used the language of political neutrality throughout his presidency, most visibly during the sustained pressure surrounding the 2022 Qatar World Cup. But the Doha statement, delivered while the Canadian Boycott Coalition was gaining international coverage, was not an off-the-cuff remark. It was delivered from a prepared text at a conference attended by sports ministers from 41 countries. It was FIFA communicating to a political audience that FIFA would not be moved. The problem is that the audience FIFA most needs to move is not the sports ministers. It is the paying fans. And the paying fans had already begun moving before Infantino walked to that podium. Here is where Boykoff's analysis becomes structurally important rather than just analytically interesting. He does not argue that the 2026 World Cup will fail. He does not argue that the boycott movement will reach a scale that empties stadiums. He argues something more precisely calibrated than either of those positions: that what is happening ahead of 2026 has stress-tested a structural tension inside FIFA's business model that has existed for years but has never before been exposed at this scale, in public, in a host country, before the tournament begins. FIFA's revenue model for a World Cup depends on 3 interlocking assumptions: that sponsors will pay for access to a global audience, that broadcasters will pay for the rights to reach that audience, and that fans will pay, in their billions, to be inside the stadiums and the host cities that make the event feel to the global television audience like the largest gathering on Earth. The boycott introduces uncertainty into the third assumption, and uncertainty in the third assumption, Boykoff writes, eventually prices into the second, because broadcasters model their bids on projected venue atmosphere and national audience engagement. A World Cup that feels politically contested inside its own host region is a different commercial product than one that does not. And different commercial products carry different price tags. That is the structural line at the center of this entire story. FIFA has always treated its tournaments as existing above politics. And that framing has been commercially sustainable as long as the fans accepted it. The fans are now contesting the framing. And in commercial sport, contested framings are expensive. Now, the dimension that connects this directly to the material world most of this audience lives in. The 2026 World Cup was projected to deliver an estimated $5.2 billion in economic activity across the three host countries, according to a joint impact study cited by both the Canadian government and FIFA. A meaningful portion of that projection was built on cross-border fan travel, on Canadian and Mexican fans spending money at American venues, in American hotels, in American restaurants, in American cities, not just attending matches at home, but making the full tournament journey. If Canadian fans attend only Canadian-hosted matches, and if Mexican fans attend only Mexican-hosted matches, that cross-border consumer flow does not materialize, not because the stadiums are empty, but because the specific consumer behavior the economic model was calculated around simply does not happen at the projected scale. For Canadian men and women who had planned bucket list trips around the tournament, who had saved for it, who had already made the decision at their kitchen tables in British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec, the savings stay home. That is not a projection. Those decisions have already been made, and the ticketing data is beginning to reflect it. A Reuters report from April noted that resale prices for group stage matches at American venues had softened relative to comparable matches at the 2022 Qatar tournament, while matches at Canadian and Mexican venues were tracking at or above comparable historical benchmarks. One data point does not make a trend, but in a market where the primary metric is directional, the direction is not neutral. The political responses at every level have been carefully calibrated to avoid escalation. The Canadian government has made no official statement on the boycott movement. The Mexican Football Federation issued a statement calling on fans to celebrate football in all its venues, a phrasing that acknowledged the pressure without naming its source. The United States Soccer Federation has not commented publicly on the Canadian coalition at all, which is itself a statement, an acknowledgement that commenting would elevate the story rather than contain it. FIFA's commercial partners, Adidas, Coca-Cola, Hyundai, Visa, and the rest of the official sponsor roster have said nothing. In the private language of sports marketing, silence from sponsors at this stage of a tournament cycle is not reassurance. It is optionality. The posture of organizations that have not yet determined what their public position will be if this movement grows and want to preserve the flexibility to respond in either direction. That silence is its own form of pressure, and FIFA's leadership is reading it. Now extend the frame one step further to where the long-term consequence of all this actually lands. The 2026 situation may become the first case in modern football's history where a host country's domestic politics, rather than its infrastructure or its safety record, became the primary reputational variable for the tournament before the opening whistle. Not a construction crisis, not a security incident, not a corruption scandal, political feeling, organized by fans without state coordination, becoming the defining story of a World Cup before it begins. That is a structural shift, not just for 2026. For every tournament that follows, the 2030 World Cup is projected across Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, 6 countries, 3 continents. Extraordinary geopolitical complexity layered across each pairing. That tournament will be selected, negotiated, and commercially priced in a world where the precedent of 2026 already exists, where the record shows that fan withdrawal, organized digitally, driven by domestic political conditions in a host country, can introduce enough uncertainty into enough commercial assumptions to become a material variable in a multi-billion-dollar projection. The governing bodies planning 2030 will know that. The broadcasters bidding for it will know that. The sponsors attached to it will know that. And the fans who drove that precedent will know it too. They were not governments. They were not institutions. They were men like Daniel Rourke with a season pass he has renewed every year for 11 years and a question he decided to ask in public because it would not leave him alone. Which brings this back to the letter. The letter that arrived at FIFA's Zurich headquarters on a Tuesday in late March. From Canadians who had saved for the experience and decided they would not cross a specific border to have it. Not all of the experience. Just the part that required them to go somewhere they had decided, for reasons they could explain clearly, they would not go. FIFA's Doha statement, "Football does not need politics, politics needs football," was written to close a conversation, to assert institutional authority over the terms of the debate, to remind everyone that the governing body sets the frame and the fans compete inside it. What the men and women of fair weather did, and what the supporters in Germany and Mexico and Argentina who took up their question did, is reopen that conversation, without asking FIFA's permission, without waiting for their governments to move, without needing the state architecture that every previous boycott movement in the history of organized international sport required to function. And the conversation they reopened is not new. It is the oldest argument in the history of sport. Whether the field of play can ever be genuinely separate from the field of power. Whether the idea of a neutral sporting space is a principle or a convenience, whether fans owe their presence to institutions that claim political neutrality while operating inside political systems that are anything but. The 1980 Moscow boycott answered that question one way: empty seats, medals with asterisks, athletes who trained for 4 years and never competed because the governments above them decided the moment required a signal. The 2026 answer, if this movement holds, will look different. Stadiums that are largely full, a tournament that proceeds on schedule, but seats in specific venues at specific stages of the bracket that carry the quiet presence of an absence, of fans who loved their sport enough to still be watching, but who drew a line at a border and held it. That is not the story FIFA wanted to be telling in the spring of 2026. But it is the story that is already being written, paragraph by paragraph, thread by thread, kitchen table decision by kitchen table decision, by people who are not waiting for an institution to tell them what this moment requires. They have already decided.